Our next topic is tapping climate financial opportunities for Pakistan. And with us we have Mahesh Mirza from FCDO, Pakistan, Hamid Sheikh of Federal Secretary Finance, Abrar Chaudhry visiting us from Oxford, David Reiner from Cambridge, Ali Habibi, who is a climate expert, and Shezad Abdul from GS Bank, in a conversation with Usman Khan from Remit.
Accessing climate finance in Pakistan and the issue that Pakistan face at the moment. Uh, Revenue mobilization, investment and trade is a British High Commission funded program, and we are working across key economic ministries, including Ministry of Finance, Federal Board of Revenue, Board of Investment, and the Planning Commission. And in our work, we are now deeply working with the government to address the climate challenge that Pakistan faces. Before we start, I'll ask my colleague Gulalai Khan to quickly introduce our esteemed panelists for today.
Thank you everyone for joining us for this panel. We all know how important it is to discuss climate change, climate finance, and all opportunities that Pakistan can have to access global climate finance funding. Today we have with us, we're very happy to have Mr. Mahesh Mishra, who is the practice lead at FCDO Pakistan. Professor David Reiner, who is a professor at the Cambridge Judge Business School with research interest in national climate change policies, social and political acceptability of low carbon technologies, environmental negotiations, and policy design. We have Mr. Dr. Abrar Chaudhry, who is a fellow at the Shezad Business School, University of Oxford, and is affiliated with Oxford's Environmental Challenge Institute, researching on topics of global environmental change, climate finance, and corporate purpose. We also have Mr. Shezad Abdullah, who is the head of investment banking at JS Bank. And we have Mr. Ali Habib, climate expert and former DG WWF Pakistan. For our panel, we had Hamid Yaqub Sheikh, who the Secretary Finance for Pakistan. He was in Lahore for this panel, but has been called by the Prime Minister for IMF and other political negotiations. But we are today joined by a representative of the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Awais Sumra, who is a Special Secretary External Finance, Ministry of Finance, and by Nashita Mohsin, who is the Joint Secretary from the Ministry of Finance and is also responsible for the Climate Finance Unit at the Ministry of Finance. So over to you, Usman.
Thank you, Gulalai, for the introductions. We also are joined with Dr. Hamid Atiq here. He is a seasoned civil servant with 30 years of experience of working with the finance division on areas of revenue. Currently, he's working with the Remit program and advising on taxation and climate issues. So I would like to start with opening remarks from Mr. Mahesh Mishra, and I would like him to talk about the importance of climate finance for Pakistan and the issues globally and how the development partners are actually thinking about this particular issue. So over to you, Mr. Mahesh Mishra.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Usman. I'm really struggling to hear online what's going on in the hall. I don't know about others online. It could be me, just my problem. But I got a gist of what he just said. Thank you very much to you and Gulalai for the kind words of introduction. And a very good afternoon from Islamabad to my distinguished panelists, senior representatives from Government of Pakistan, and participants. Sorry?
Yes, Mahesh, we can hear you, so we can start.
Okay, sorry. So, I think much has really been said and written about significance of global finance, climate finance globally as well as locally. So I would like to skip that part of the question and focus my remarks essentially on 3 points. My first point will be around the significance of local ownership and local solution. And my second point would be focused on challenges surrounding unlocking of international climate finance And third one would be, not really a sales pitch, but just to share some information around what exactly the government of UK is doing. uh, Climate change. Uh, so the first point around, significance of local ownership and local solution. Um, Climate change is a global issue, and the impact of it is shared by all, and also the cost therefore has to be shared by all. I think I'm making this point because while uh, climate justice narrative is very, very powerful and it rightly resonates across the world, and therefore there is a responsibility for developed countries to share the cost, make technology available. But it is important that for that support to be effective and impactful, there has to be uh, strong local ownership, leadership of this agenda, and also given that there is no one size fit kind of fit all solution. The solutions that we look for has to be contextualized, locally owned, and locally grown. And from that point of view, local leadership, local ownership is very, very significant. And within the issue of local ownership, I think the role of non-state actors, especially private sector, cannot be overstated. Public finance is limited, and relative to the size of and magnitude of the need is always going to be limited, and in the context of very difficult international economic situation, it's getting even increasingly more and more limited. So there is a need for us to think in terms of what role public finance can really play. And I'm of the view that I think the best use of public finance is in the area of where it can be a catalyst, uh, in the sense that it helps leverage funding from private sector and other actors, and therefore, uh, there is a need to think in terms of how best public finance can be used to help buy down risk, demonstrate feasibility of new ways of doing things so that we are able to crowd in private finance and finance from other sources. So, that's why I think, local ownership, local solution is absolutely critical. And within that, it shouldn't be just about government. It should also be about the role of private sector and non-state actor, what role they can play in there. Uh, Coming to the second point around challenges of unlocking climate finance. Uh, there has been a growing demand and supply of international climate finance. But unfortunately, experience over the past several years has demonstrated that disbursement is not really fast enough. And there are several issues as to why disbursement is not fast enough. And if you look at example of Pakistan has been able to mobilize something like 130 million, compared to, say, for example, a small country like Mongolia, which has mobilized around 450 million. Bangladesh, its neighbor, has mobilized around 375 million. And even Nepal and Bhutan have done significantly well in relative terms compared to Pakistan. And part of the problem is, this is not really Pakistan alone, but in the context of emerging markets and developing countries, is that, it seems that siloed approach are not really working. Uh, Climate finance, climate change cuts across several, almost all development priorities of government. And whether it's education, health, infrastructure, energy, you name it, and there is climate change and climate finance involved in that. Therefore, there is a need to think in terms of a whole of government approach, where governments are able to integrate and mainstream climate finance requirement into their approach for limiting the impact of climate finance and finding solutions around adaptation and mitigation. There's a need for a whole of government approach where every single agency and institution acts as a climate agency. Without that, it's very, very difficult to find solution to it. There are also issues surrounding the structure and processes of international climate finance funds run by bilaterally or multilaterally by various institutions. Their risk appetites are different, their mandates are different, and the kind of patient capital that some of climate finance, climate change solutions require is perhaps not really available. And there is also a capacity issue in terms of developing countries being able to take high quality projects to these climate finance window. So there is a need for international development partners to think in terms of, standardization is not really going to be possible, but to the extent it is feasible, drive in some level of consistency in the mandate, objectives, the risk profile, and tenor of some of this funding. I think if we are able to make some progress in that direction, that is going to be very, very helpful. So, the final point is around what is the UK government doing? First of all, we as UK government are taking a very integrated approach to climate change and climate finance within the UK, and also in our international support to developing countries. So we have integrated this across several government departments, including the key ones like the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, of which I'm a part, our Department of International Trade, HM Treasury, then our DEFRA, the Department for Energy, Forest and Agriculture, our Department of Transport. So we are trying to take an integrated approach. And we are also committed.
Mahesh, sorry to prompt you for time as well.
Sure. I'll wrap it up quickly. So we are also taking a very, we are also committed to deliver on the pledges that we have made as a part of our presidency of G7 and COP26. And, our support to developing countries on this is organized within the banner of our initiative for Clean Green initiative. And BII, the British International, at the heart and center of our offer in terms of financial support for developing countries. Significantly, Pakistan happens to be one of the 6 powerhouse markets for BII, where BII is looking to significantly ramp up its investment in green projects. We are also working with developing countries to help them mobilize institutional capital through capital market instruments. We have a global program called Mobilist, which is mobilizing institutional capital through listed products. And that is essentially, providing technical assistance and other type of support to developing countries to help them mobilize green finance through instruments like, say, for example, green bonds. we are also working with financial institutions, banks, insurance companies to look at, insurance-based financing product to help both private sector as well as government in mobilizing finance. So, let me take a pause there. The essential point that I'm trying to make here is that mobilizing international climate finance does require a whole of government and whole of society approach where we are not really siloed, pursuing it through siloed approaches, but taking an integrated approach to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahesh.
Thank you, Mahesh.
I'll next move to Dr. David Reiner. So, Dr. David, I'd like to ask you that in the current global scenario, can you please talk about the political and social aspects of climate change and the much talked climate justice paradigm in global climate conversations, and what relevance can we draw for most vulnerable countries like Pakistan, and what should be a fair narrative that the country needs to build to access this global resource that we have?
Great, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I've followed climate change since being at Kyoto far too long ago, back when my hair was not so gray. And I think we have seen an evolution of obviously the role of emerging markets, emerging economies in the kind of global landscape. And the history of climate finance has, it's been growing. We've seen in many ways remarkable progress. But it never quite delivers up to the expectations or the aspirations, or rather maybe the magnitude of the challenge that we're talking about. And thought of in the kind of larger geopolitical landscape, it's maybe understandable why that is the case. I mean, it wasn't really until 2009 in Copenhagen when we had this commitment of $100 billion a year. Not just climate finance, but various instruments to transfer to emerging economies. Now, as we well know, that $100 billion a year target hasn't been met. It's getting closer. People will argue with this year, next year, so on, when it will be met. But I think that doesn't. That shouldn't undermine the fact that actually has been, in many ways, a significant victory to get to that sort of level of investment. Now, how that investment actually is distributed is also an important question, and I think was raised by the previous speaker, because at some level, if the aspiration of the international community is $100 billion a year, that can go in different ways, and it's both a geopolitical question, but then it's also a question of the attractiveness as from the private sector in terms of an investment opportunity. So I don't want to kind of overstretch the kind of idea of a zero sum game, even though that's the cover of The Economist this week. But we are talking about a world where that is quite important, both in terms of the governments and in terms of private investors. So you can ask, well, where have we seen progress? Where have we seen kind of this this narrative succeed? Just at the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, we saw quite a bit of focus on the so-called loss and damage and so-called loss and damage facility. I'm not usually optimistic. I mean, the people who follow these things closely, who care deeply about these things, take some solace about the fact that there's been some progress in that regard. But we've seen many iterations of these sorts of large-scale funds. I think the more interesting examples or more interesting progress we've seen, notably through the efforts on the kind of climate investment funds for South Africa, and then more recently Indonesia, particularly focused on a transition away from coal. No, I know the South Africa situation a bit better than the Indonesia situation, but I think there's some, there have been some, quite challenging kind of detailed discussions that have had to go into moving from the kind of the press release, the mobilizing the different actors to actually translating that into real funding. But it's in many ways it's not an accident that a handful of countries have moved maybe to the front of the queue to begin almost as a bit of a template for how the international community might structure kind of a focused effort on climate, on the energy transition in particular, in kind of leading emerging economies. And so one thing I would say is that I think that as just kind of laid down by the previous speaker, there are a number of, even just within the kind of South Asian neighborhood, there are a number of other countries that would be, I think, ahead of Pakistan in terms of where the international community would think to invest, or think to potentially replicate this sort of arrangement. And so I do think that this is quite crucial time to be looking to these kind of initial efforts, as in South Africa, as in Indonesia, to see what works, what doesn't work, what has been effective both in terms of internally within these countries, but then also in terms of that external engagement, how best to attract, how best to kind of formulate essentially the offer for this kind of large scale, many hundreds of millions, billion plus pound arrangement. So I think that's an important thing. I think the other thing, which we can't avoid as well thinking about, is the larger geopolitical landscape, which on climate has been one of the few areas that has been largely constructive. In other areas, it's been in many ways more tense and more difficult. So obviously the Chinese effort on the Belt and Road Initiative, where Pakistan was kind of quite important in being involved in that, is challenging from a reputational perspective, because at least from my understanding, it was seen in many ways as halting efforts towards renewables and doubling down on coal. And so that, I think, then kind of, there've been some, again, from my understanding, some notable efforts on kind of in the last few years moving forward on renewables, but from a international reputation point of view, it then becomes all the more important to really make some very significant progress in terms of, for example, things that we've looked at, like renewable auctions, other mechanisms to kind of demonstrate that the deployment of lower carbon technologies would be done in a way that would be done at lowest cost, most efficiently, and if you can kind of build up more of a track record in terms of that is quite important, because it is striking that in many ways many other countries that are actually at even quite low levels of development, sub-Saharan African governments and so on, have made fairly significant progress in terms of these sorts of auctions for renewables. And so again, I just leave you with the fact that we are in a period where kind of there's greater and greater attention to climate finance after I think many, I don't know, false starts, but very slow starts. And so we are now talking about a period where there is, I think, potential opportunity for significant mobilization of resources, but we are also dealing in a world where many governments, both within the neighborhood, but then also in the wider global South, are also, recognizing these, potential opportunities for inflow of these green finance investments, and it is in that competitive landscape that Pakistan will need to distinguish itself.
Thank you, thank you, David, and making the important point on building capabilities within to actually access, and I think that was also touched by Mahesh as well. So my next question to Mr. Shezad Abdullah from JS Bank is, talking about these capacities. So one of the areas that, as a first step, is also getting accredited with these global funds to actually access these. And given JS Bank is one of the few organizations in Pakistan who've made that plunge, so I'd like you to, take us through the process very quickly in terms of the challenges, learnings, and also sort of way forward in terms of how we can do more of what has worked and less of what did not work.
Thank you, Usman. It's a pleasure to be here with you all to speak on behalf of JS Bank today. So, first of all, I think my previous guests have touched upon a couple of points, and I think JS's journey has been a fairly long, slightly slow, but a very focused journey towards getting this GCF funding and being the only accredited commercial bank in Pakistan to receive this. So I think it's a overall it's a learning ground for in terms of efficiencies, environmentally friendly implementations of projects, and I think there is a growing, increasing awareness of that in Pakistan. Like all implementations, coming from completely from a funding side. I feel that as we go along, we will find our way through it. But it's about focusing on where we're moving and what we would like to move in. There would probably not be any major standardization to implement this, but it also comes down to how JS move forward with it, and something which I would like to share with you is that JS being a market player in the commercial segment, commercial banking financing side, it's focused a lot on the SME and the commercial segment of the banking population, and more importantly, it has been at the forefront of enabling a lot of environmentally friendly, energy efficient projects for typically a slightly lower segment of the SME segment of the market. Now, we have so I think there was additionally what happened, what's really transpired is the vision of the management, vision of how the sponsors think about environmental projects. So it has been one of the key drivers or catalysts of moving towards a GCF accreditation was a clear-cut buy-in and management buy-in and focus towards environmentally friendly projects. So while GCF, there's also engagement from the GCF side. There has been a very close look at what we as a bank have done in Pakistan towards creating that enabling environment, and that I think has been a trigger point also, a very major trigger point for us also in terms of capacity building. I think we've internally worked hard, and another positive thing I think we have done towards moving towards this is that we have even collaborated to pick on the talent or pick on or collaborate with people who have the understanding of this and have worked on multiple pieces of creating this space for accessing GCF funding. Further, I feel a very key important factor is also that JS has been very successful in terms of getting the accreditation where they have access to up to $250 million for a project. And we are currently have signed up for the Pakistan Development Solar Project, which is our first project which we are going to move towards an implementation. I think rather than having, there's also another factor is that rather than having focusing towards getting multiple accredited entities, I think we have the capacity to work and collaborate with other institutions to launch projects. Unlike what we've seen in the past, rather than coming into getting into a race towards just focusing on being an accredited entity or having a nameplate that having specific funding. I think they should be more focused in collaboration in terms of projects. And as the market and as as this entire ecosystem develops and moves forward, I think there should be more collaboration towards it. In terms of I think the bigger, I think one of the questions or one of the areas which you just mentioned upon is also compared to other countries. How do we, we've had a few points to discuss on this. How do we move forward, or how do we have a bigger share or more, a more significant contribution towards environment? And I think that significant contribution can be while seeing actual projects being implemented, having an impact on the overall environment, overall economic and also social and environmental elements of this of Pakistan. So I think as we go along and we have successful implementation of projects, we should be able to get way more bigger. There will be actual work on ground done, so there'll be way more bigger access to funding and bigger access to global funds who will be able to take it more seriously and be more focused and interested in working with us.
Thank you, Shezad sir. Next, I'll move to Dr. Abrar. Dr. Sab, I think the one resounding word in this conversation is the climate readiness, if you want to summarize. And I think the policymakers and all partners are very serious for Pakistan into increasing their footprint in this particular area. So what do you see some of the probable sources, but also some of the key barriers, and how do we go about breaking those barriers for Pakistan?
So thank you so much, first of all, for the Remit team to really organizing this session. I think it's a very important topic that we should be speaking more and more about climate finance, about climate change, and how do we bring in the much needed funding that Pakistan needs. But before I start that, and kind of really appreciate the comments that have come in from the other speakers who have really been touching on things that I wanted to speak about to see, how do we build capacity? How do we become ready? I think one thing that we need to recognize is where we are. Like, we obviously, Pakistan exists in the larger global context as well. So we really have to understand, what's happening in the larger context as well. And when you look at climate finance, it's of course a very broad term, but we also need to understand what it really means. And if we kind of dissect climate finance, of course, there are two parts to it. And I'm sure many of you already know about it. It's the mitigation part, the part where we really focus on, reducing the impacts of climate change. The projects like, clean energy or looking at clean transportation. And that's where most of the funding has been going towards. Like if you look at the global finance, 95% of funding goes towards mitigation. And the reason is that it's easier to measure, it's easier to build projects around it. It's easier for funders, private sector financiers to understand what's really happening because it's tangible, there's a carbon element to it. But when we start to focus on the adaptation side, and that's where I think, which is also extremely important for Pakistan and most emerging countries, is that we have to live with the impacts of climate change. So how do we get funding for adaptation? How do we get funding to build capacity of our communities, of our infrastructure? And now, more recently, we've been hearing more about the loss and damage funding as well. That's where the situation starts to get a bit tricky. Because what's really happening is that, we not just Pakistan, but our region, the entire emerging economies are really competing for a much smaller pot of money. We're competing for 5% of the money. Even when we speak about GCF, although GCF is mandated to give money for adaptation, they're really struggling. And the reason they're struggling is that they're trying to figure out how do we get real projects that focus on climate change. It's not about development. When you take a project to GCF, you take a project to Adaptation Fund, you take a project to any funder, the first question they ask is, what's the climate rationale? How will this funding really help us deal with the impacts of climate change? Not about development, not about helping communities, not about giving them money, but how will this help them counter the impacts of climate change that will come? And that's where, our capacity starts to be tested. I've spoken to many, many countries. I've spoken to many successful project developers across the world, from like many small countries in sub-Saharan Africa to Oceania. And one question I always ask them is, how did you do this? How did you get the funding? What helped you succeed? And it's a very simple answer. It's a very intuitive answer. There's nothing, nothing scientific about it. Their answer always was that, well, first was, had we known how long it would take, we would never even go for it, because it really, tests your ability. So jokes apart, I think the real learning is kind of building the learning mindset, understanding that what we're going in, we don't really have an answer, but what we really need to do is start collaborating, start understanding that climate change is a wicked problem, which means there isn't a silver bullet. There isn't an easy solution. There isn't something that we can just bring in and solve it. We really have to understand, iterate, talk to actors that we're not used to talking to. For a project developer, he has to start speaking with the government agencies, not just speaking to them, but figuring out how to work with them, speaking to different other NGOs, speaking to their competitors, speaking to universities to get the science together. So it's really a very different way of working. And for organizations that were successful, really put that collaboration, that interaction at the heart of their project development. Because you can't build readiness, you can't build capacity through a single organization, right? And so the moment you start to build those projects, the moment you take those projects to funders, they'll say, okay, where's the climate science? Show us, prove to us that this really is robust. And so you really need to start thinking about, how do we build those collaborations? And organizations and countries that have been successful really have gone to their government agencies, have gone to their entities and said, what, this is a new way of working. I know we compete. I know there isn't an approach of working together. How do we set structures? How do we set networks that would allow information to flow very quickly? Now, what happens in Pakistan? I've been involved in project, and I'm sure our colleagues from GS Bank will second that. The moment you start to go beyond your organizational boundary and start to talk to government and start to talk to other organizations, say, I need this documentation. It takes months and months. There's no reason for that to happen. And the reason is that understanding needs to develop at the other side. That capacity needs to develop. Why are we doing this? What's the benefit? And just that timing itself pushes us back. Remember, we are competing for funding. And as the funding is getting more competitive, David spoke about the $100 billion figure. That $100 figure is a static figure. Actually, we haven't met that figure. But the urgency or the impact of the challenges are going up every day. We had floodings in Pakistan. We alone spoke about 30 billion. Nigeria had flooding. Mexico had flooding. They're all demanding that money. So the bar for the projects is going up. We need to make an even stronger case. And it hence means we really have to not just come out of our silos, we really have to set up a model of speaking to each other, of making sure there's no red tape, making sure that, we get the best science locally, but outside as well. And that leads me to the second kind of aspect, which is about, building those capabilities. I think what we lack in Pakistan and many emerging countries, and it was touched upon, is developing really strong, robust projects that meet those criteria. And so where will that capacity come from? If we look at the current readiness, if we look at the current structures of projects, most of the projects that are being developed, not just in Pakistan, across the world, are coming from multilateral organizations. And I don't have anything against those organizations. I think it's great. But what's really happening is that all that capability of building projects, developing projects, implementing projects remain with those organizations. And that creates a virtuous cycle for them, but a vicious cycle for local organizations because they haven't experienced that. They haven't gone through the road of getting those projects developed. So my urge is for all these multilateral organizations, they are, yes, we need the money, but more than the money, we need a transfer of capabilities, not a transfer of technology, but transfer of capabilities. You have to work with local organizations. You have to help them develop those capabilities. You have to work with universities to get the right science. And my final point here is maybe a provocation or identifying an opportunity. We as Pakistan, as emerging economies, look at climate finance coming from outside. And we think, okay, we're suffering, so the world will look up and if we develop the right projects, we get those funding. Sure, some of that money does make its way on ground, but it's absolutely not even close to what's required. In order to move our energy system, in order to move our agriculture system, in order to help our communities, we're talking about multi-billion dollars that's required. And I think that's where Pakistan has to start looking at the opportunity of how do we create projects? How do we build capabilities to access not just development funding, but the growing market of climate finance and climate technologies that's evolving. To give you an example, just the global energy transition will require about $9 to $10 trillion. And that money will start to come from private sector. That money will start to come from entities other than governments. What Pakistan really now has to start thinking about, how do we build those capabilities within our educational institution? How do we create climate leaders? How do we build climate scientists that will start to work on that opportunity? Because that's the next 10 years. That's where we need to build in. And if we build those capabilities, if we work with organizations, if the private sector is also bold, we will start to pull a lot of this money into Pakistan, but also start to export capabilities similar to what other countries have done in technology or other countries have specialized in other things. I think this is the opportunity of Pakistan because we are a climate hotspot countries. We are a country that experiences climate all the time. And I think we are the ones who should be developing those solutions, not just for Pakistan, for the rest of the world. And I think that's how we will get ready. If we keep waiting, I'm sorry, it will take a lot of time. And by that time, these opportunities will go away. So that's my urge and my request for the audience that you start thinking about building projects, ideas on climate change, on climate technologies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Abrar, and raising quite pertinent points. I mean, this last week I was engaged with, met a National Disaster Risk Management Fund that was set up by the government back in 2016. And I think this came up very closely when I was trying to review what they've been doing, is the capacity really to do projects that would move towards disaster risk or controlling, climate risk as well. I think the bar really needs to go up because that's how the good projects would come. And going to our next speaker, Ali Habib, I think just asking you in terms of, because you worked with the private sector recently quite a lot on climate change mitigation and adaptation and helping them take steps. So what do you feel are the really constraining factors in terms of getting these projects, and what are more relevant projects that we can really focus on if we move towards building the capability gap that Dr. Abrar also talked about?
Thank you, Usman. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'd like to, in terms of the question you've asked me, just like to make three quick points. So I think the first one is that the private sector is already active in a number of projects which would now easily be categorized as climate finance. Often the case is that They're undertaking projects based upon their priorities, aligned with government efforts, but they're not necessarily categorized as climate finance. So there are actually already a number of initiatives, and I can give you a few examples. So I'll talk about that. Second point I want to make is what are the present national priorities against which we should align all our efforts of raising climate finance. And the third point I'll make is what is the key role the government could play, especially the
Ali sir?
So going back to examples of private sector, I can quote a few. So the Overseas Chamber has recently come out with a white paper on climate change with focus on the urgency to raise climate finance. Now, I think they're sort of indicating that a lot of money needs to be raised from outside Pakistan, but I want to make a case that raising money from outside Pakistan would be much easier if Pakistan raises a proportionate amount from within their resources. And so if the OICC were to set up a cell which assists any member organization to develop a robust project like Dr. Abrar has mentioned, so that's the kind of role that we should push back to the private sector, that they can play the role. Other examples are that after the 2022 floods, Pakistan is planning a major rebuilding exercise, and they use the right term, build back better or build back greener. And the Architects Association of Pakistan is very keen to assist the government in helping develop climate resilient designs, which are also consistent with the local sensitivities in terms of the local cultures, because one can understand houses in Sindh, in Tharparkar, in Punjab would be different based upon the traditional approaches of societies. So I think these are the good examples. They're already in place, and I'll come to how we can enhance that. In terms of your point about why isn't it getting more traction, I'll come to it a bit later as well. But I just want to give the example. The reason why the JS Bank Renewable Energy Green Climate Fund project is successful is that they were able to raise the finance, but the regulatory space was already well defined by the Alternate Energy Board, by NEPRA, in terms of the positive policies of net metering, where excess solar can be sold back to the grid. So those regulatory frameworks acted as leverage, catalysts, smoothers for such programs. A similar program, there is an effort to undertake similar programs for energy efficiency in industry and the private sector. And the IFC has already done a study, and the estimate is that there is an appetite for $17 billion worth of financially viable investments in various sectors to enhance energy efficiency. Now, that's clearly a bankable case, but there are weak regulatory frameworks in terms of enhanced energy efficiency. The State Bank does not yet have a funding line, which they do for renewables. The National Energy Efficiency Authority has yet to notify standard appliances like air conditioners and refrigerators. So once the government does its part, then it unleashes the opportunity for the private sector to quickly fill in that space, because the regulatory mechanism supports private investment.
Ali, I'd like to move to next. Sorry to cut you because we're just quite short on time. I just wanted to sort of stop at this point because I would like now to refer to Madam Nashita Mohsen, representing Ministry of Finance, and I think you've raised a very pertinent point in terms of really government taking steps forward as well, whether it is really looking at raising local finance or really the integrated approach that was talked earlier as well. So Nashita, would you like to talk a bit about the role of Ministry of Finance and what the more recent initiatives are and an approach going forward? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is Nashita. And let me start by actually thanking the Remit team for arranging the panel discussion on a very important subject. I think we would all agree that the recent floods in Pakistan and the devastation caused, was a rather painful reminder of why we need to have this conversation and at the highest level. So, in terms of what the Ministry of Finance is thinking and how we are working towards it, I'd like to say that the first thing is that we are trying to dedicate as much time and effort as possible to learning more about it, because that is the stage that we are currently at. This time, the Ministry of Finance participated in COP27 for the first time to make sure that we, stay abreast of the latest developments in climate change, and that is something that we are going to continue henceforth. The second initiative is that we have set up a dedicated climate finance unit at the Ministry of Finance. And at this stage, we are actually trying to ascertain what are the areas in which the Ministry of Finance can intervene successfully, while making sure that we keep all stakeholders on board. And just taking sort of a note from what Mahesh said earlier, it's very important to make sure that all the stakeholders, which includes like multiple ministries and the provincial governments, they are taken on board. Before we come up with an approach, everybody needs to actually have the buy-in. We would also need to build the capacity of that unit, because at this point in time, as was mentioned, by one of the speakers, we are more conversant with the idea of financing for development. And that is something that we have traditionally done at the Ministry of Finance and at the Economic Affairs Division. So that is definitely something that we are more accustomed to. But definitely, looking at climate finance, it requires sort of reorienting the government structures and also the thought process that we've been sort of following till date. So we are actually in conversation with FCDO and some of the other development partners to make sure that the climate finance unit identifies areas in which we can successfully intervene. Of course, some of those choices are severely curtailed by the current macroeconomic environment that the country faces. And we do want to make sure that whatever options we identify, in the long run, they have to remain sustainable for us, in terms of leveraging external debt or, some of the other options that we might be looking at. So one of the speakers also pointed out something that is very relevant to Pakistan, and that is the challenge that we, at this point in time, we may not exactly have answers to, but that is definitely a conversation that we would like to take forward. In terms of, if we talk about Pakistan is one of the lowest emitters, right? So in terms of the funding that we need for adaptation, that is much harder to get than mitigation, as was correctly pointed out. But frankly, that does not address the core issues that the country is facing. And as Mahesh pointed out, it's important to make sure that while there is a global context to it, we must not ignore the local context of the discussion. And in Pakistan's case, adaptation is, I wouldn't want to say it's more important or less important, but I would say that that is something that we would really need to prioritize, especially, some of the recent developments and, some of the areas that have been identified in the PDNA, the post-disaster needs assessment that was conducted jointly by all the development partners and the government, which was also presented at the, the International Conference on Climate Resilient Pakistan, just a few days back. So those are some of the needs. The needs are huge, but exactly how would we be able to leverage resources, and especially at this point in time, what we are witnessing is that there is a lot of emphasis on private sector finance and private sector transactions. And while that is very important, But it's also important to understand that the government has obligations which go beyond something that would necessarily generate a return or a profit that would cover or that would warrant the investment from private sector. So those are some of the that's a bit of a challenge. How do we look at certain things when we don't want to call it development? And yes, we want to talk about the climate rationale, but there are areas where the government has to intervene regardless of whether it's profitable or not. I would say it's, we kind of go back to the ages old public goods debate. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to talk about. And thank you again for arranging this very useful panel discussion. And we would definitely want to keep this conversation going. And we value the input that we receive from all our partners. And we hope to hear more about it and kind of, if we could sort of broaden this discussion to include other development partners as well, that would really help us with the coordination issues that also seem to crop up whenever there is sort of when there is more than one entity involved. Thanks again.
Thank you, Nashita. Thank you, Nishita, for these remarks, especially pointing out that, and I think David also talked about the silification of the work that we need to move away from. And we're really grateful to all the participants who could take out time today for this important conversation, talking about, of course, collaborations, partnerships, and also the fact that probably there has been no, this is the only time, the most important time right now to talk about this and also act on it. And the fact that the public sector representation was here, and we can see that the regulatory and other mechanisms that need to be in place to access these funds are also is also something that we are now taking up as development partners, as well as different collaborations with other partners. I would just want to now ask Nafama Tehniyat if she can just give us a closing remark, which since we are now just almost at the end of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Gulalai, and the team for arranging today's session on a very important and current topic. A key point highlighted in the dialogue today is the need for readiness of stakeholders and their requisite capabilities. And this is where exactly Remit comes in. As the name suggests, Remit is Revenue Mobilization Investment and Trade Program with an overall mandate to support economic stabilization and inclusive growth in Pakistan, focusing mainly on revenue mobilization, investment, trade, and energy. In the wake of recent floods and considering the climate-led disaster risks that Pakistan faces, Remit, being a flexible program, has quickly adapted its approach by providing technical assistance to stakeholders and taking steps that will improve Pakistan's national capability to take climate mitigation and adaptation steps. One such example is the climate finance unit that we are supporting Ministry of Finance on in helping the government design policy, regulation, and financial instruments for catalyzing climate financing. I will like to encourage Remit's implementation team to enhance their exposure to supporting Pakistan's fight against climate risks and assure UK government's full support to Government of Pakistan in creating the required financial space. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I also want to thank members of the audience who were here with us today. And if you have questions, we have our email address, which we will just put on the slides. And please do send us your queries and questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, David Reiner. Thank you, Dr. Abrar Chaudhry, Shezad from JS Bank, Mahesh, Tehniyat, and Nishita for joining us, for taking out time. Thank you so much.